بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله نحمده ونستعينه ونستغفره ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا من يهده الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلل فلا هادي له وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله أما بعد فإن أحسن الكلام كلام الله وخير الهدى هدى محمد صلى الله عليه وسلم وإن شر الأمور محدثاتها وكل محدثة بدعة وكل بدعة ضلالة وكل ضلالة في النار. So today is lesson 20, I believe, in our series. That's the 20th lesson on the book Taqreeb Tadmuriyyah by Sheikh Ibn Uthaymeen rahimahullah. And in the previous lesson we looked at two examples or two similitudes given by Shaykh al-Islam Ibn Taymiyyah rahimahullah to illustrate the fact that just because two things share the same name or the label does not mean that the realities that they point to or that are behind them are the same. So he gave the example of paradise. There are things in paradise which have the same names as the things that we experience in the life of this world, such as water and honey and various types of foods and spouses and so on and so forth. And as Ibn Abbas radiallahu anhuma said, that there is nothing that is on earth which is in paradise except the names, right? So the only thing that we have in this world are the names of what is in paradise, not the actual realities. Likewise, he gave the example of the soul. The soul is a true and real existing thing. It's an actual entity. It exists in the body and outside of the body as well. And the soul itself has attributes, has various attributes, but we are unable to fathom the reality of this soul and how it has those attributes. So these are examples from within the creation where these things are described. They have essences, they have attributes, and yet we are incapable of comprehending the actual realities, right? So just because they have the same name doesn't mean that the realities are necessarily the same. So the purpose behind giving these examples is to show that in the same way, there is absolutely no problem, no caution with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala being described with names and attributes and actions and having an essence. This in no way means that he resembles his creation just because the names or the labels are the same. So this was the purpose behind those two similitudes given by Shaykh al-Islam. And now we come to the rest of the treatise, in which Ibn Taymiyyah rahimahullah is going to elaborate on what has already preceded in a bit more detail by way of, I believe, 6 or 7 principles, right? So there are 6 or 7 qawaid or principles, some of which are a repetition of what we've looked at before from the introduction, others which are new principles. So what we are going to do in the rest of the series, inshallah ta'ala, is to work through these principles one by one. And as you will see, there's some degree of repetition, but repeating things, it helps a person to revise and understand and to cement things in the mind. So some of these things will be familiar, but there's a bit more detail provided as well. So before we continue, you should have a handout, another handout, and this has 2 sides. There are 2 sides to the handout. The first one is basically like an overview. It's like a structural overview of the whole book. And it just allows you to keep a track of where we are, and you can see the contents of the entire book. This is the one without the diagram. It's the one with just the headings and the list, right? So this is like really a structure of the book, and so you can look at that and see where we are going, and you can quickly identify the various principles. So it's very, very useful. And the other side of the sheet, where you have the chart this is something that's been given up before. This is a bit more clear. It's actually an old diagram from quite a while back. But this helps you to visualize a bit more clearly the various groups. What is it that they are affirming? What is it that they are denying? So as you can see from the top, we have the people of the Sunnah who affirm for Allah His essence, His names, His attributes, His actions. And as you go further and further down, you start seeing with the Ash'aris, and then the Mu'tazila, and then the Jahmiyyah, and then the Falasifa. Eventually, we end up with, what amounts to the non-existence of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because like with the philosophers, they don't describe Him with anything. And it's really just a notion or a figment of the imagination, and that's it. Right? So in between, you see various groups who are affected to one degree or the other in negating the attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So that again is a useful kind of overview, and that will help you to grasp the second part of the series. So the first part of the series was an introduction with various basic principles. The second part of the series was looking at each group and their position, and looking at the arguments and counter-arguments. And the third part of this book is now looking at the kind of additional principles, 6 or 7 principles that will give us further clarity and further understanding of the issue. Right, so that's just a kind of a recap and an overview. So starting today's lesson then, this is lesson 20, we begin with the Al-Khatimah. This is page 47 in the book, for those of you who have the book. So the Shaykh says, Shaykh Ibn Uthaymeen, rahimahullah, that this ending of the book, it comprises numerous very beneficial, mighty principles. So the first of those principles, al-qa'idatul ula, anna Allah ta'ala mawsufun bin nafi wal ithbat. The first is that Allah, the Exalted, is described with both negation and affirmation. So we've discussed this previously, that whenever we speak about Allah, we follow the methodology of the Quran. And in the Quran, we clearly see Allah affirms for Himself in a detailed and specific way, and Allah negates from Himself in a limited and a generalized way. And the Shaykh goes on to say, this means, what this principle means, is that in the Quran, Allah Azza wa Jal has combined, when He describes Himself, He's combined between an-nafi wal-ithbat, negation and affirmation. A very clear example of this is the well-known famous verse, which is the pillar in the issue, or a foundation in the issue of the attributes of Allah. It is the statement of Allah, "Laysa kamithlihi shay, wa huwa as-sami'ul basir." This is chapter 42, verse 11. Chapter 42, verse 11, at the end of that ayah. Laysa kamithlihi shay, wa huwa as-sami'ul basir. There is nothing which is a likeness to Allah, and He is all hearing and all seeing. First half of the verse is a negation. There's no likeness to Allah. Second half of the verse is an affirmation of His hearing and His seeing by way of His two names, As-Sami' and Al-Basir. And the Shaykh goes on to explain that what is the reason and the wisdom and the purpose behind combining negation and affirmation in the Quran. It is because you cannot establish perfection for a thing being described except by combining these two things. And affirmation of the perfect attributes and negation of those attributes, right, which Allah has negated, such as becoming tired, becoming weary, being incapable, oppression. Perfection cannot be established except when you affirm attributes of perfection and you negate attributes of deficiency. Right? This is the only way that perfection can be established. That's why in the Quran we see this methodology. And as the Shaykh goes on to say, everything that Allah has affirmed for Himself, it is an attribute of perfection. Allah says, وَلِلَّهِ الْمَثَلُ الْأَعْلَى. وَلِلَّهِ الْمَثَلُ الْأَعْلَى. To Allah belongs the loftiest example. This is Surah Nahl, Surah 16, chapter 16, verse number 60. And so these attributes, Allah has the loftiest example, meaning the attributes of perfection, whether they are attributes that His essence is described with eternally, these are permanent attributes, or whether these are attributes which are tied to His will, to His action. Right? So irrespective of which we are speaking of. Some attributes of Allah are eternal, permanent attributes. Just to explain, just to clarify this. So we have some attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, which are attributes of His essence. They are permanent, right? Allah is living. He has life. Allah is hearing. Allah is seeing. Allah has knowledge. Allah is Al-Azim. He is the mighty, right? And so on. These are permanent attributes of His essence. Then, so let's call this the first category. Then we have some other attributes where they are both permanent, eternal attributes from one angle as it relates to His essence, and then they are also tied to His will, right? So an example of that would be the attribute of speech, of kalam. Allah is one who speaks. He has always had the attribute of speech. He's eternally one who speaks. But this attribute is tied to His will. So Allah will speak when He wills to speak. This is why Allah spoke the Quran, He spoke the Torah, He spoke the Injil. He will speak on the Day of Judgment to the believers, right? These instances of speech, they are tied to His will. So from one angle, Allah has always had the attribute of speech. He's always one who speaks, but His speech itself is tied to His will. When He wills to speak, He will speak. And, so this is a second category. The attribute is eternal, but it's tied to his will, right? And then the third types of these are actions which Allah chooses to do, but they are not like attributes which are eternal of His essence. For example, Allah made istiwa, right? He created the heavens and the earth, and then He ascended above His throne. He chose to ascend above His throne. Right, so this action of istiwa is not something that Allah is eternally doing, right? And likewise, Allah, He becomes angry by way of things which necessitate His anger, and Him becoming angry is tied, He wills. It's tied to His wisdom, and so on. So these are other attributes. We don't say that Allah. We can't derive names from these attributes. We don't say one of the names of Allah is Al-Mustawi. We don't say one of the names of Allah is the angry one. No. Because these are things which are tied to Allah's will. So anyhow, the point being that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is described with attributes of perfection, whether these attributes are the eternal, permanent attributes, or whether they are the attributes which are tied to His action, to His will, and to His power and wisdom. Okay, on the next page, the Shaykh goes on to mention some of these attributes which Allah has affirmed for Himself, general attributes, and from them he says, فَمِن صِفَاتِ اللَّهِ تَعَالَى الَّتِي أَثْبَتَهَا لِنَفْسِهِ الْحَيَاةُ وَالْعِلْمُ وَالْقُدْرَةُ والسمع والبصر والإرادة والكلام والعزة والحكمة والمغفرة والرحمة. He says, from the attributes that Allah has affirmed for Himself is life and knowledge and power and hearing and seeing and irada, which is wish, and kalam, which is speech, and al-izzah, which is might and power, and al-hikmah, which is wisdom, and al-maghfirah, which is forgiveness, and al-rahmah, which is mercy. These are some examples. And the Shaykh goes on to explain some of these attributes to show how, for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, these attributes are attributes of perfection in contrast to the creation. So for example, the life of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, it is what? It is hayatun kamila mustalzima li kulli sifatil kamal. The life of Allah, in contrast to our life, it is complete, perfect, which in turn necessitates all other attributes of perfection. This life was not preceded by non-existence. Right? Allah did not come to be. And nor is this life going to be followed by expiration or expiring or ending. Right? So as Allah says in the Quran, وَتَوَكَّلْ عَلَى الْحَيِّ الَّذِي لَا يَمُوتُ. Place your trust upon Allah, the one who does not die. Right? So death is negated from Allah. So this is in contrast to us. Because although we have life, it's going to be followed by death. And likewise, our life itself was preceded by its non-existence. So here, this is Allah's attribute of life. It is unlike our attribute of life. Our life is deficient, and the life of Allah is perfect and complete. So that verse there is Surah Al-Furqan, chapter 25, verse number 58. And likewise, another verse which indicates this is the verse which mentions two names of Allah, Huwa al-Awwal wal-Akhir. He is the first. He is the first, meaning without beginning. And He is the last, meaning without end. So this is another verse that shows the life of Allah is complete and perfect, not preceded by non-existence and not followed by non-existence either. Likewise, the statement of Allah Azza wa Jal in Surah Al-Baqarah, this is Ayatul Kursi, where Allah says, Allahu la ilaha illahu al-hayyul qayyum la ta'khudhuhu sinatun wa la nawm. Allah, the one besides whom none is worthy of worship, al-hayy, the ever living, and al-qayyum, the one who establishes and maintains everything. So all of these verses collectively, they show or they contrast the life of Allah being perfect and complete and unlike ours. So that's one example. Second example is Allah's ilm, Allah's knowledge. So again, Allah's knowledge is complete, perfect. It is not preceded by ignorance, whereas our knowledge is preceded by ignorance. We come to know things that we didn't know before. And nor does His knowledge, is it followed by forgetfulness. Whereas we know things, we retain them for a while, and then we forget things, right? Whether on a short term or a long term. So Allah's knowledge encompasses all small and great things, near and far things, right? So this is the knowledge of Allah. It is unlike our knowledge. And a number of verses, first verse is in Surah Taha, Surah 20, verse number 52. قال علمها عند ربي في كتاب لا يضل ربي ولا ينسى. This is when Fir'aun is asking Musa alayhi salam, what is, the knowledge of past nations, or it's the knowledge of the hour, that the knowledge of this is with my Lord in a book. My Lord does not err, nor does He forget. And likewise, the statement of Allah, Inna Allah bi kulli shay'in alim. Indeed, Allah has knowledge of everything. It is Surah Al-Anfal, Surah 8, verse number 75. So again, these two verses, they establish the perfection of the knowledge as an attribute of Allah, unlike our knowledge. Our knowledge preceded by ignorance, followed by forgetfulness. Likewise, the Qudra, the power of Allah, the attribute of power. It is not preceded by inability, nor is it followed by tiredness. Right? So this contrasts with our attribute of power. We are born incapable, There are many things we are incapable of. And then when we do certain things, we become tired thereafter. And so the power of the Qudra, the ability and the power of Allah is unlike that. It is free of deficiencies and shortcomings. From the verses which establish that is the statement of Allah Azza wa Jal, وَمَا كَانَ اللَّهُ لِيُعْجِزَهُ مِنْ شَيْءٍ فِي السَّمَاوَاتِ وَلَا فِي الْأَرْضِ إِنَّهُ كَانَ عَلِيمًا قَدِيرًا. There is nothing that can render Allah incapable in the heavens, nor in the earth. Indeed, Allah is Alim and Qadir, is all-knowing and He is all-powerful. Surah Fatir, Surah 35, verse number 44. And similarly, the statement of Allah at the end of Surah Talaq, لِتَعْلَمُوا أَنَّ اللَّهَ عَلَى كُلِّ شَيْءٍ قَدِيرٌ وَأَنَّ اللَّهَ قَدْ أَحَاطَ بِكُلِّ شَيْءٍ عِلْمًا. In order that you may know that Allah has power over all things and that Allah has encompassed everything in knowledge. So here in this verse, Allah's power and His knowledge encompasses everything. The Surah Talaq, Surah 65, verse number 12. And finally, وَلَقَدْ خَلَقْنَا السَّمَاوَاتِ وَالْأَرْضِ وَمَا بَيْنَهُمَا فِي سِتَّةِ أَيَّامٍ وَمَا مَسَّنَا مِنْ لُغُوبٍ. We created the heavens and the earth in 6 days, and no tiredness touched us. No weariness or tiredness touched us. So this is Surah Qaf, Surah 50, verse number 38. Again, this contrasts the Qudra, the power of Allah, with our Qudra. And one more example the Shaykh gives to highlight, which is the wisdom of Allah, the hikmah of Allah. The hikmah of Allah is hikmatun baligha. It is a wisdom which is far-reaching, and it is devoid from any kind of frivolity or lack of purposefulness, and it encompasses all of what Allah has created and all of what Allah has legislated. Meaning that in the creation of Allah, in what Allah has created, there are far-reaching wisdoms, right? So, within the way that Allah has created life and rocks and plants and water and the way things work in the creation, there are far-reaching wisdoms. We may be able to study and understand some of them, but within Allah's creation, there are things that we would never fathom the far-reaching wisdom behind these things in the way that they work, in the way that they are tied together. And similarly, in the legislation of Allah, in what Allah has legislated for His servants, of the halal and the haram, and the commanded and the prohibited, in terms of worship and dealings. Likewise, Allah's wisdom, there is a far-reaching wisdom in these things, some of which, as the Shaykh says, he says that we are incapable of comprehending the wisdom of Allah in His creation and His legislation, though we may be able to comprehend some things if what Allah opens up to us in terms of knowledge about that. So there are some things that we can understand, but there are many things that we will never be able to grasp the wisdom behind it. So this shows that obviously our wisdom and even our ability to comprehend the wisdom of Allah, that shows that our attribute of wisdom is unlike the attribute of wisdom with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So the Shaykh says, upon this, like the way that the Shaykh has explained 1, 2, 3, 4, 4 attributes, we apply the same thing to all the other attributes, right? So the Shaykh has mentioned numerous ayat to establish the difference between Allah's attributes and our attributes, and we just apply the same to all of the other attributes that are mentioned. So this is from the angle of affirmation. These are things Allah has affirmed for Himself, and they are attributes of perfection. On the other hand, Allah Azza wa Jal, He has negated from Himself. So from the attributes that Allah has negated from Himself, they are as follows. By way of example, Al-Maut, which is death. Al-Maut, which is death. والجهل, which is ignorance, والنسيان, which is forgetfulness, والعجز, which is to be incapable, and والسنة, which is again tiredness, and النوم, which is sleep, واللغوب, which is like a type of weariness and fatigue, والإعياء, which again is like similar, weariness, tiredness, fatigue, والظلم, and oppression. Right? So these are things that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has specifically negated from Himself. Some examples of verses from the Quran to establish this. وَتَوَكَّلْ عَلَى الْحَيِّ الَّذِي لَا يَمُوتُ. Rely upon the ever-living who never dies. The 25th chapter, verse 58. And likewise the verse earlier from the statement of Musa alayhi salam, لا يضل ربي ولا ينسى. لا يضل ربي ولا ينسى. My Lord does not err, nor does He forget. Surah Taha, Surah 20, chapter 52. And also the verse, وَمَا كَانَ اللَّهُ لِيُعْجِزَهُ مِنْ شَيْءٍ فِي السَّمَاوَاتِ وَلَا فِي الْأَرْضِ. Right? There is nothing which makes Allah incapable. Right? He does not have ajaz, inability. We also mentioned that verse earlier. لا تأخذه سنة ولا نوم. Ayatul Kursi. Tiredness nor sleep do not overtake Him. وَمَا مَسَّنَا مِن لُغُوبٍ. Same verse we mentioned before in Surah Qaf. Right? Nothing of tiredness or weariness touched us. وَلَمْ يَعْيَ بِخَلْقِهِنَّ. وَلَمْ يَعْيَ بِخَلْقِهِنَّ. This is i'ya. This again is like being made incapable by way of tiredness. That is Surah Al-Ahqaf, verse number 33. So that would be chapter 46. I think Surah Al-Ahqaf, chapter 46. And وَلَا يَظْلِمُ رَبُّكَ أَحَدًا. Surah Al-Kahf. Your Lord does not oppress anybody. No one is oppressed. There's no dhulm. And this is Surah Al-Kahf, Surah 18, verse number 49. So these are examples of things that Allah has negated from Himself in the Quran to show that He is free from these deficiencies and that He has perfect knowledge, perfect power. And included within this would be things where Allah has negated for a reason because people have made claims, like the claim that He has a son, or the claim that His hands are tied, meaning He's accused of being niggardly by way of the Yahud, by way of the Jews. So He explicitly negates and denies these things. So this is negation. And the Shaykh goes on to mention an important principle regarding negation that we discussed earlier. He says, وَكُلُّ صِفَةٍ نَفَاهَ اللَّهُ تَعَالَى عَنْ نَفْسِهِ فَإِنَّهَا مُتَضَمِّنَةٌ لِشَيْئَيْنِ. Every attribute that Allah has negated from Himself, it comprises two things. So for every negation made by Allah in His book, there are two things which are within that negation. The first, intifa'u tilka sifa. First, the first thing, which is the obvious thing, which is a negation of that attribute. This is the obvious thing. So Allah says that He does not sleep, does not become tired. Right? So the first thing is the very thing being negated. Negation of that attribute. And the second thing is thubut kamali diddiha. Thubut kamali diddiha. Which is an affirmation of its perfect opposite. The perfect opposite. So if we say that Allah does not sleep, nor does He die, that means He is the ever-living. And if we say Allah is not oppressive, He does not do dhulm, it means that He is adl, that He is just. And if we say Allah is not deaf, it means that He is hearing. Right? So every negation has to comprise the opposite perfection. So an example of that in the Quran is the verse that we also mentioned earlier, وَمَا كَانَ اللَّهُ لِيُعْجِزَهُ مِنْ شَيْءٍ فِي السَّمَاوَاتِ وَلَا فِي الْأَرْضِ إِنَّهُ كَانَ عَلِيمًا قَدِيرًا. Right? There's nothing which renders Allah unable, or which Allah is incapable of, in the heavens and the earth. Indeed, Allah is all-knowing and all-powerful. Right? So first of all, he negated al-ajaz from himself, inability. And then at the end of the verse, he affirmed perfect knowledge and power. Because knowledge and power are the things that, give you power, ability, and so on and so forth. So as the Shaykh says, he negated al-ajaz, and then he affirmed the perfection of his knowledge and his power. So in the same way, when we negate dhulm from Allah, what does it automatically comprise? His perfect justice. And when we negate al-lughub, which is again tiredness, and what is similar, it establishes the perfection of his power. And when we affirm, when we negate from him tiredness and sleep, it affirms his perfect life and him being the maintainer of everything. Right? So you get the basic idea. Now, from this, the second point is that whenever we make negations from Allah, it is not possible that negation is just a pure negation, right? So meaning, we've just established that every negation made for Allah, it comprises two things. We negate the thing, obviously the attribute, and then also it comprises the perfect opposite by necessity, right? So the next point is, there can be no such thing as a pure negation. Nafi mahad. This thing does not exist as it relates to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Right? Because this would not be indicative of perfection. So for example, if you said that Allah is not blind, and the only thing you intended by that was simply the negation of blindness in itself, without comprising the perfect opposite, then this would not entail any type of praise for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And there are numerous reasons why this cannot be the case, right? There's numerous reasons why a negation as it relates to Allah cannot comprise the opposite. There are numerous reasons why that cannot be the case. The first point, the first reason, is that Allah Azza wa Jal said in the Quran, وَلِلَّهِ الْمَثَلُ الْأَعْلَى. To Allah belongs the loftiest example. Meaning, to Him belongs the most perfect description. The most perfect description. Al-Wasf Al-Akmal. And if we were to describe Him, say for example that Allah is not deaf or blind or ignorant, and we claimed that we are making only just the pure negation in itself without comprising the perfect opposite, which is Allah's perfect knowledge and Allah's perfect hearing or perfect seeing, then this would not, we are not really affirming anything positive for Allah. It's just a mere negation. It's like a mere negation. Right? So this is the first thing. Allah said, وَلِلَّهِ الْمَثَلُ الْأَعْلَى. To Allah belongs the most perfect description. And a negation, a pure negation, does not amount to any perfect description. That's the first reason. Second reason is that the pure negation in itself, an-nafi al-mahd, is simply adam mahd. Right? Which means, what this means is that when you make a negation of a thing whilst denying its perfect opposite, then the only thing you have done is, you've not affirmed anything positive. It is pure negation and nothingness. Like you haven't added any extra knowledge about the thing that you are describing. So again, to give the same example, if we said Allah is not blind, and we are making only a pure negation, we're not we are denying the fact that this automatically comprises his perfect seeing, right? So what have we brought of any knowledge here? Nothing. The negation itself is not bringing any knowledge. It's a pure negation, and so therefore it amounts to no extra knowledge, right? So this itself would not comprise perfection for Allah. There's nothing. There's no knowledge here. That's the second reason, right? That pure negation is simple non-existence, absence. There's nothing that we are bringing. The third reason is that, now the best way to describe this would be to give an example to explain the point here. Is like if we said about a wall, right? So imagine like a wall. And imagine I was to say about the wall that the wall does not commit dhulm. Right? And I intend to praise the wall. Right? So this is like a praise. No, look at how the wall doesn't oppress anybody. Okay, what's happening here? The wall itself does not accept the two opposites of oppression and injustice, right? We don't say about a wall that the wall is oppressive or unjust. We don't say about the table or the chair. We don't say these things about these things because they don't accept these two attributes of dhulm and or adl, of justice or injustice, right? So this, if we were to make the negation, the wall does not oppress, well, this doesn't comprise any praise because the wall cannot accept either of these two attributes of oppression, injustice, or justice. So in this case, there's nothing of praise contained for the wall when we say the wall is not unjust, right? So what this means is that it's another angle to explain that if negation doesn't comprise the perfect opposite, it cannot be a praise. It cannot be a praise, right? So in this case, like in the case of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, like if we say Allah is not unjust, and we negate injustice from Allah on the basis that Allah cannot be described with the opposite, right? So in other words, to these people, Allah is neither unjust nor is He just, because they believe, just like with example with the wall, that Allah cannot accept either of these two attributes. In principle, Allah can't accept these two attributes, either injustice or justice. So if you now come along and say, well, Allah is not unjust, how does this comprise the praise of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? If in principle He can't accept either of the two attributes. Justice for Allah, negating injustice from Allah can only be a praise if He's described with the perfect opposite. Right? So you get that point. That's the third reason why negation in and of itself cannot be, a praise. The fourth reason, it is kind of similar to what we've explained, and this would be like when you negate, again, best to use the example given by the Shaykh, which is imagine someone has been oppressed by somebody, right? So imagine someone has oppressed you. Imagine that someone has stolen something from you. Imagine someone has physically harmed you in some way. And you are too weak and incapable to be able to, to seek revenge or to rectify, establish your right? So imagine you are incapable. You are weak. You are powerless to get your property back or to establish justice, right? For the harm that's been done to you. So what you now do is you say that, or you mention a text where you say an evil is not recompensed with another evil. Right? So you say, oh look, evil is not to be responded with evil. Okay, now why did you say that? Why did you say that? Did you say that because of the principle, or did you say it because you are actually incapable? Right? It's not that you're applying the principle, it's because you are physically unable and too weak to be able to actually establish your right and establish justice. So the point being here is that in this case, this wouldn't be a praise for that person, right? If that person said, oh no, I'm not going to return an evil for an evil, right? And you think this is praise, but it's not, because this person, the reason why he's not doing it is because he was actually incapable. He was too weak, too incapable, or maybe too cowardly, or whatever it might be, right? So this now is not a praise. So from this angle, if we make a negation for Allah and it doesn't comprise the perfect opposite, then it cannot be a praise. Why? Because, like if you say Allah is not incapable, Allah is not incapable, that has to comprise His perfect power and ability. Right? It has to be so. And the only reason why it can't be so is because, that person, from his deficiency, does not have that property or that attribute, right? So I hope you get these two last points. The first two are fairly straightforward. The second two, the point 3 and 4, is really what it's saying is that, if we don't accept that a negation has to imply and comprise the perfect opposite, what are the reasons why this might be, right? From the reasons why this might be is, like, for example, a wall, for example, it doesn't accept the two opposites of justice and injustice, right? That's one reason why a negation might not imply its perfect opposite. Or the second reason might be is that, it's because of the deficiency of that person himself, right? So when it comes to creatures, like we said in the example, a man might be wronged, stolen from him, harmed in some way, and he's incapable of responding, right? It's due to his inability and incapacity, right? So, but these things don't apply to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? And that's why this principle that when we make a negation from Allah, it has to, by necessity, comprise and imply the perfect opposite, right? Because Allah does not have any of the deficiencies of the creation. So if we say Allah is not blind, it means He has perfect sight. If He's not unjust, He has perfect justice. If He is not unable and that He's not powerless, then He has perfect power and ability. And so on and so forth for all of the other things which are negated from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. After that, the Shaykh goes on to mention some lines of poetry, a series of lines of poetry. The essence of the poetry, really, I'll summarize it, is really he's speaking about a tribe which has, something stolen from them. The camels are taken or something like this, and they are too weak or cowardly or unable to do something about it. And, you can't now come and say that this inability is really, it's like a praise for them, and it's like, gentleness or whatever. No, you can't say this. This is, so in this poetry, the writer of the lines of poetry is trying to incite and stir up this tribe to basically, stand up and do something, and that this is not like a praiseworthy trait to be like this, right? So the Shaykh is mentioning that poetry to establish that point. So finally, we come to the final few paragraphs, and the Shaykh says, وَبِهَذَا عُلِمَ أَنَّ الَّذِينَ لَا يَصِفُونَ اللَّهَ تَعَالَى إِلَّا بِالنَّفِي الْمَحْضِ لَمْ يُثْبِتُوا فِي الْحَقِيقَةِ إِلَهًا مَحْمُودًا بَلْ وَلَا مَوْجُودًا كقولهم في الله عز وجل إنه ليس بداخل العالم ولا خارجه ولا مباين ولا مهايث ولا فوق ولا تحت ولا متصل ولا منفصل. So he says, Allah indeed, so he says, from all of this discussion, it is known that those who do not describe Allah except with pure negations, they have not affirmed in reality a deity or a God, a deity, an ilah, which is praiseworthy. In fact, one that even exists. One that even exists. And the Shaykh gives an example of some type of speech that you hear from the philosophers and the Jahmiyyah, is that they say Allah is not in the world, nor is he outside of the world, nor is he attached to the world or to the universe, nor is he detached from the, separate from the world of the universe, nor is he above, nor is he below, nor is he connected or not connected. So all of this type of language, it's really, it establishes what it amounts to is the non-existence of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. These are all meaningless descriptions. They don't give us any knowledge of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, which is praiseworthy. Then the Shaykh mentions a statement of one of the, I believe it's like one of the rulers of the past. ولهذا قال محمود بن سبكتكين لمن ادعى ذلك في الخالق جل وعلا ميز لنا بين هذا الرب الذي تثبته وبين المعدوم. So he says one of the Mahmud bin Subkatakain, he said to the person who claimed the likes of these things about the Creator, he said, distinguish for me, ميز لنا, distinguish for us, بين هذا الرب الذي تثبته وبين المعدوم. Distinguish for me between this Lord that you are affirming and between non-existence. Tell me, what's the difference between, like when you say this deity that you allegedly believe in is not in the universe, nor is it outside the universe, nor is it above the universe, nor is it below the universe, nor is it attached to the universe or separate. Explain what's the difference between that and between a non-existing thing. There isn't any difference, right? So this kind of amounts really to atheism and negation of Allah's very existence. And so the Shaykh says, وَلَقَدْ صَدَقَ رَحِمَهُ اللَّهِ, that indeed he spoke the truth, because that which is non-existent, a non-existing thing, cannot be described in a way greater than this type of description. If you wanted to describe a non-existing thing, what language do you use? You say the same speech as what these people are saying. You say, it's not in the universe, it's not outside the universe, it's not above the universe, it's not below the universe, it is not this, it is not that, it is not blind, it is not deaf, it is not this, it is not. You start make all these negations, right? This is the greatest description that can be given to a non-existing thing. And yet these people make this to be the foundation of their speech about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? So this is why this is pure atheism. That's why on the sheet, if you turn around, you look at the diagram and you start from the top and you work your way downwards, then you see that, when you start negating something from the attributes of Allah, then by logical and rational consistency, you will be led further down to eventually, speaking about Allah in the way that we are discussing, right? With language that implies His non-existence. And that's why this issue of, these principles and this topic is from the greatest and mightiest of topics, that it is upon a Muslim to understand this well and to understand the nature of the mistakes of these people. So the Shaykh finishes by just saying that someone who says Allah is not did not come before the universe, nor did he come after the universe, nor is he hearing or seeing or speaking, and uses all these negations, then it is binding upon him that whoever he is describing is dead, blind, dumb, deaf, Because this is what you would be implying by using this type of language. And so this shows the tremendous misguidance in all of this. So this brings us to an end to the first rule of the 7 rules. That rule is that Allah is described with both affirmation and negation. And the important thing here is that whenever we make a negation for Allah, then it necessitates the perfect opposite always. Right? There's no such thing as just a pure negation. And the Shaykh mentioned 4 reasons for that. And so inshallah we'll conclude our lesson there for this week. And next week there will not be a lesson, so I'll be away on the Sunday. So inshallah the next lesson will be in 2 weeks' time, inshallah ta'ala. So with that we'll conclude. Walhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wa sallallahu ala nabiyyina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in.